Hey everyone, and welcome to this, our very last lecture video, and today we'll be covering the endocrine system. So starting off, you probably are already familiar with the fact that endocrine system relates to organs that release hormones. And these organs are going to feature endocrine glands that contain epithelial cells that are secretory. So they produce hormones and secrete them either into the blood or the extracellular fluid surrounding that cell. So once a hormone is circulating in the blood, it's going to have widespread effects in the body, as opposed to communication via neurons, where a neuron is going to interact with a distinct group of cells. A hormone released into the bloodstream is going to affect lots of different cells all around the body. So what are the effects once a hormone reaches its target cell? Well, it's going to primarily be changes within that cell. So this signal tells the cell it needs to make some change in its behavior or its structure. So one effect is that it can stimulate secretion. So some hormones actually stimulate secretion of other hormones from other endocrine organs. Or they can stimulate secretion of things like enzymes from an exocrine gland. So stimulation of secretion is one effect that's possible. And it's also going to, the effect of hormones can also control these three things. Transcription, so a change within a cell is often going to be determined by what the changes in transcription are. So many cells change their activity based on what sorts of proteins they have available to them. And if they change their patterns of transcription, that's going to be upstream of the changes in proteins that you'll see. So if a hormone, for example, is telling cells, let's say we're talking about insulin, which you learned a lot about. Insulin tells cells they need more glucose transporter proteins in their plasma membrane. So what the response of cells is to insulin is to increase, first, transcription to make copies of RNA that can then be translated into those glucose transport proteins that allow the cells to do what they need to do in the presence of insulin, which is to take up more glucose. So changes in transcription are very important effects of binding of lots of hormones. Also growth hormone, you see increases in transcription of structural proteins. And that's going to help cells to grow in size and to divide. Also, hormones can affect how cells make certain reactions happen. So hormones can affect the activity of enzymes. And they can also open and close ion channels. So you could imagine how the presence of a hormone, if a certain ion channel in a neuron is responsive to a hormone, certain hormones could make certain groups of neurons more or less active. And that can have a wide variety of effects. So these three levels of control can be either inhibitory or they can be stimulatory. So you can either increase or decrease the transcription or the activity of certain enzymes or the opening or closing of ion channels. So let's real quickly walk through the process of a hormonal signaling cascade, is what it's called. So you have these epithelial cells that are that make up your endocrine gland, or the tissue that's going to be releasing hormones. So within these cells, you have production of your hormones, and these cells are going to release those hormones into the extracellular fluid around them. Now, these are going to be close to a blood vessel in many cases, and so these hormones will make it into the bloodstream and be able to travel throughout the body. Now, for its a hormone to exert an effect, the cell that is the target of that hormone must have a receptor for that hormone. So these receptors can be on the plasma membrane for certain classes of hormones, or those receptors can be inside the nucleus for hormones that regulate things like transcription. But each receptor is going to have a specific shape that's going to allow it to bind to a specific hormone. So a cell must have a specific receptor in order to be stimulated by a specific hormone. So these hormones are going to circulate through the bloodstream and eventually make their way to all the tissues in the body. And cells that have these receptors will bind that triangle-shaped hormone that fits right into that receptor like a lock and key. So that binding is going to change the shape of that receptor and cause some internal change inside of the cell. So again, that could be a change in transcription, that could be a change in the opening or closing of ion channels, the change in the activity of certain enzymes, etc. Now, I mentioned before that insulin is going to increase the number of glucose transporters, and insulin sensitivity, as well as the sensitivity of any cell to any hormone, is going to depend on the number of these receptors that there are for a specific cell. So if there's a lot of hormone circulating for a long period of time, eventually cells become desensitized to that hormone. Because there's so much of it around, the cells are going to alter their sensitivity. And that's to provide kind of a solid, a normal, a regular level of responsiveness to a hormone. And changing the number of receptors in a cell for a particular hormone, either adding more receptors, which would make a cell more sensitive, or removing receptors would make this cell less sensitive to this particular hormone. Those are both regulation of the receptors. So adding more receptors is called upregulation, meaning the cell has created more receptors for this hormone. And downregulation, which again is going to decrease sensitivity to a hormone, is simply having fewer of those receptors. So cells are able to change their sensitivity based on the number of receptors. And as I mentioned, the longer a hormone persists and the more of it there is, that's going to kind of favor downregulation to lower the sensitivity of cells to this persistent signaling mechanism. And likewise, if a hormone is available in lower levels, cells want to increase their sensitivity to that hormone by upregulation, or creating new or more numerous receptors for a particular hormone. So looking at the different types of hormones that there are, we classify these based on their structure. So some of them are made of amino acids, and those are going to be hydrophilic, meaning they tend to gravitate toward water. And then you have your steroid hormones, which are derived from cholesterol. And as you know, cholesterol is a lipid and it's hydrophobic. And these are going to tend to enter the cell. Whereas amino acid based hormones are going to bind plasma membrane receptors. So they're going to stick to the outside of the cell. Steroid hormones, being that they enter the cell and bind receptors in the cytosol or in the nucleus, they're often associated with really internal changes in the cell, like those changes in the amount of transcription. So lots of, you think of steroid hormones probably increasing cell growth, and that's going to come from the fact that these hormones enter the nucleus and change transcription directly, allowing them to stimulate activities like making new structural proteins that make cells get bigger and able to divide more frequently. Taking a look at the different endocrine organs, you have these separated into primary endocrine organs whose only function is producing hormones. And then you have secondary endocrine organs who have a primary function that is not producing hormones. So looking at the primary endocrine organs, these contain lots of the glands that some of which you've learned about, like the parathyroid gland producing PTH, parathyroid hormone. You have the adrenal cortex, which we've talked some about, making the stress hormone cortisol, for example. The endocrine pancreas, so the bit of the pancreas that produces insulin and glucagon, is considered a primary endocrine organ. Whereas the secondary endocrine organs, like the heart and the kidneys, and the small intestines for that matter, having really obvious primary functions that are not producing hormones, but they still have the capacity to produce hormones. The testes and the ovaries, also their primary function is to produce either eggs or sperm, but they also can contribute to producing hormones that affect sexual characteristics. You also have neuroendocrine secondary endocrine organs, and this includes the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, which are in the brain, and this is nervous tissue, but it's also going to be nervous tissue that can release hormones. And you have the adrenal medulla. So in those adrenal glands, you have the outer cortex, and you have the medulla, which consists of this nervous tissue that also releases hormones. So again, primary, only one function, to produce hormones. Secondary, they also produce hormones in addition to their day job, pumping blood or what have you. So like so many biological functions, hormone release is going to be, in many cases, controlled by negative feedback loops. So let's take a look at one example of how this works. The hypothalamus is kind of a control center for many hormones to be released. It's going to dictate when certain hormones are released. In this case, we're talking about the thyroid hormones T3 and T4 that are produced by the thyroid gland located in your neck. And these thyroid hormones, when released, are going to increase the metabolic rate. So oftentimes thyroid defects are associated with obesity, and that's because the thyroid controls metabolism. So the release of T3 and T4, these thyroid hormones, ultimately depends on the hypothalamus. Why is this? So the hypothalamus releases a hormone called thyrotropin releasing hormone. And now what this means, so what thyrotropin releasing hormone does, and what the hypothalamus is responsible for in general, is producing these releasing hormones. So these releasing hormones exert their effect on the anterior pituitary gland. And the anterior pituitary gland is going to release what are called tropic hormones. And these tropic hormones ultimately control the release of hormones from their primary glands, like the thyroid. So for this whole cascade to occur, you need the hypothalamus to decide to release thyrotropin releasing hormone. That's going to cause the anterior pituitary gland, its target, to release thyroid stimulating hormone. So this term tropic just means it's going to stimulate release of another hormone from its, the gland that's primarily responsible for releasing the thyroid hormones. So the only effect that these two hormones are going to have is stimulating the release of other hormones, whereas the ultimate effect of T3 and T4 is to increase metabolic rate. So I mentioned that this is going to be controlled by negative feedback. So the higher levels you have of T3 and T4 in your system, they are going to increase their effect on the metabolic rate, but they also have an effect of inhibiting the activity of the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So the more T3 and T4 there is, the less TRH and TSH are going to be produced, which is in turn going to decrease the production of new thyroid hormones. So this is your negative feedback. The more thyroid hormones you have, it feeds back into the earlier parts of the loop and inhibits the release so that you can maintain relatively stable levels of your thyroid hormones. And these feedback loops occur along this axis. So in addition to the thyroid, the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary are also going to control release of hormones like the sex hormones. So your testosterone and estrogen are also going to be controlled in this manner. And we'll look at those a little bit more closely in a second. But just generally, many hormones have this negative feedback regulation. So as we just saw before, the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary are going to work together to control many processes, and this includes things like your body temperature, the circadian rhythms, your sleep-wake cycle, also things like thirst and hunger and fluid balance. So lots of bodily functions are controlled directly by the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. And the hypothalamus exerts its effect on the anterior pituitary gland. It controls release of anterior pituitary hormones. And the anterior pituitary is one of those true glands. It doesn't have a nervous function, unlike the posterior pituitary, which is a secondary endocrine organ that has regular nervous function as well as producing hormones. We'll mention the posterior pituitary in a minute. So we already talked about thyrotropin releasing hormone, which causes the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, and this is going to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce those thyroid hormones. Likewise, you have the gonadotropin releasing hormones. So that GN, that gonad part of gonadotropin releasing hormone, is referring to the gonads, the testes or the ovaries in females. So gonadotropin releasing hormone tells the anterior pituitary to release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, FSH and LH. And these are both going to target the sexual organs. So your testes and your ovaries. And it's going to control release of further hormones like testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. So sexual characteristics are regulated in this manner. The hypothalamus controlling the anterior pituitary, which then controls the gonads. Also growth hormone. So you have growth hormone releasing hormone that's released onto the anterior pituitary that then releases growth hormone. And growth hormone is going to stimulate growth of lots of different cell types in the body. So again, these are going to be negatively regulating themselves. There's also adrenal gland function that's affected in this same manner. So I'd encourage you to take a look at your book and look at these different hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary gland, and look at what their target tissues are and what their ultimate function is going to be. taking a look at the posterior pituitary, which again is one of those secondary organs that has nervous function and also some endocrine function. So the posterior pituitary does not manufacture its hormones, but it does control their release. So the manufacture of these hormones, ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin, are going to be manufactured elsewhere and transported to the posterior pituitary, where it stores them and controls their release. So ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. And you know that a diuretic, probably you know this, is going to make you pee more. The way that antidiuretic hormone works is that it causes you to retain sodium. And in the kidneys, water is going to follow the sodium. So if you keep more sodium in your body, you're also going to keep more water in your body. And less of it is going to be released, less water released into the urine. So that is how antidiuretic hormone works, is by increasing sodium retention. That allows us to retain water and not lose it in the urine. It's also going to control the release of oxytocin, which many of you are probably familiar with, being associated with pregnancy and childbirth. So oxytocin affects, its targets are the mammary glands. It's going to increase your lactation, milk production, and also is going to cause contraction of the uterine smooth muscle. And that's, of course, going to assist the process of childbirth. Oxytocin is also thought of as kind of the love hormone. It's associated with bonding behavior in parent and child. If you were to take a look at the histology, or the cells within the thyroid gland, you would see a structure that we call a follicle. And within this follicle, you kind of have this sphere or tube of follicle cells, which I've abbreviated FC. And then next to them you have the parafollicle cells, or parafollicular cells, excuse me. So these two cell types both release a distinct hormone. The follicle cells release the thyroid hormones T3 and 4 that increase metabolism. And if you have a defective, a defect in your thyroid gland, you can get hypo or hyperthyroidism. So if you have a hyperactive thyroid, you would say you would have hyperthyroidism, and then it's gonna be hard to put on weight. Whereas hypothyroidism, you're gonna have decreases in your thyroid hormones, and you're going to see weight gain. So oftentimes, if someone has a thyroid issue, you're one way or the other, you're going to see some deviation from normal healthy weight. The parafollicular cells, you might already be familiar with their hormone calcitonin, which is part of our body's way of regulating calcium levels in the blood. Calcitonin is going to inhibit the activity of osteoclasts, meaning osteoblast activity is favored, and storage of excess calcium. So when you have an extra calcium, your parafollicular cells are going to release calcitonin in order to build new bone. If you take a look at the thyroid gland, you would notice these adjacent structures, the parathyroid gland, which is going to release parathyroid hormone, which we've already discussed some, and it has the opposite effect again of calcitonin. So it's going to increase your osteoclast activity, releasing calcium to increase blood calcium levels. And in addition, it has an effect on the gut and the kidneys of increasing calcium absorption in the gut and calcium reabsorption in the kidneys. So the kidneys typically filter out excess stuff and things that we want to put back in the blood as opposed to putting out in the urine are reabsorbed. So this is actually going to be kind of a downstream effect. So in the kidney, you get activated vitamin D, which is called calcitriol, as an effect of parathyroid hormone. And calcitriol is going to have the effect of increasing the kidney's reabsorption of calcium. So for our very last video segment of the semester, I want to talk about the adrenal glands. And if you see these kidneys that I've drawn right here, the adrenal glands are going to sit right on top of the kidneys. So the adrenal glands themselves are made up of an outer cortex. So if you looked at the adrenal gland, you'd have the outer cortex and then an inner medulla. And the inner medulla is made up of neuroendocrine tissue, whereas the adrenal cortex is a primary, is considered a primary endocrine organ. So, whereas a neuroendocrine organ is considered secondary. So the cortex is responsible for releasing aldosterone, and that's important for the kidneys because one of their main jobs is to regulate the volume of water in blood, and this can regulate blood pressure. So your kidneys and the adrenal glands are going to work together to regulate blood pressure, and they do this through the activity of aldosterone, which causes an increase in sodium retention. As we mentioned before, water follows sodium, so if it's retained, you're going to increase blood pressure because you increase the amount of water in the body and thus in the blood. Cortisol is a stress hormone that's going to be released by the adrenal medulla, and its effect is going to be to increase the amount of glucose in the blood. So in a fight or flight situation or a stressful situation, it's helpful to have enough blood glucose to deal with whatever that situation might be. And if your cortisol levels are too high, you can actually get free fatty acids that can lead to a number of disorders. So you get these buildups of these fatty acids leading to a disease that is sometimes referred to as moon face. So too much cortisol can be an issue. And finally, the adrenal medulla, as I mentioned, it's a neuroendocrine organ, so it's primarily a nervous tissue with an endocrine kind of side function. And within the medulla, you have these cells called chromaffin cells, and they're going to release epinephrine. So this is epinephrine, as we talked about when we were looking at the autonomic nervous system. Epinephrine release is controlled by the sympathetic neurons. So the sympathetic nervous system makes contact with these chromaffin cells and controls the release of epinephrine in a fight or flight situation. So that'll do it for our discussion of the endocrine system. I hope you've enjoyed these videos, and I wish you all the best of luck on all of your final exams.